The first reading today is Ezekiel 28, verses 11 through 19. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me. Mortal, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, carnelian, chrysolite, and moonstone, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald, and worked in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. With an anointed cherub as guardian, I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created, until iniquity was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and the guardian cherub drove you out from among the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. So I brought out the fire from within you. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever.
The reading from Ezekiel is not totally unlike some other prophetic writings in the Old Testament. And all of them show that even early on in our faith development from Hebrew to Christian, the Judeo-Christian tradition, that it was believed that even the workings of nations had something to do with God. Okay? Now, Tyre, we don't know for sure how they used to pronounce that word in the past, but it's spelled, if any of you read it in the scriptures, T-Y-R-E, Tyre. And the first time I ever heard this, I remember as a kid, I was raised outside Akron, Ohio. And when I heard about the king of Tyre, I thought it was the mayor of Akron, you know. But see, Tyre in those days, and this is way back, was a city-state. Have you ever heard of that? A city-state has its own army, its own navy, all those kinds of things. And you think of a castle and things like that. It was also the richest of all the city-states known to the world at that time. So here's this guy, Ezekiel, who happens to be a Hebrew prophet. And God says, hey, Ezekiel, go to the king of Tyre and say this stuff. Now, did you hear what he said to him? I mean, some of the greatest words in Scripture. You have corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. All the nations are aghast at you, and you have come to a dreadful end. Wow. Ezekiel was supposed to say this to the king of Tyre. You got that? Okay. The first time I ever became really familiar with that little excerpt from Ezekiel, while I was still a senior at Princeton, there was this group that I had gotten involved with called the Chapel Deacons. Now, don't get all excited. Back then, all we did was read one of the lessons on Sunday at the worship service. And my senior year, I was the one that was in charge of getting people, so I, of course, I had it this one Sunday when William Sloane Coffin Jr. was preaching. Now, how many of you remember that name? William Sloane Coffin Jr.? Okay, if you don't, Bill Coffin at that time was the chaplain at Yale University. He was extraordinary gifted preacher and speaker, a former CIA agent who had gone to seminary. He was the son of a wealthy, wealthy family. He had married the daughter of Arturo Rubinstein. I mean, he was quite a guy. And he was really active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He'd been arrested a number of times on charges that finally got thrown out by the courts. But still, I knew he was coming, so I thought, I know, I'll be one of the readers. So I had never met Bill Coffin before. And if you ever saw the chapel at Princeton, it's this magnificent cathedral-like building. It's just huge, it's gorgeous, and it seats in the pews. It'll seat 3,000 people, okay, so it's big. Well, that Sunday, before the service even got close to starting, there was standing room only. Well, the person who was the reader, okay, the student, was supposed to go to this other side of the chapel building. You go in a door there, and that goes to the dean of the chapel's office, his study. And that's where you were supposed to be before the service started. So I went in there, sat down. Dean Gordon was out doing some busy work and stuff. So I was just kind of sitting there. And maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes before the service was supposed to begin, in comes Dean Gordon, who is the man who wrote The Bridge Over the River Kwai, if you're familiar with that book. Anyway, so he comes in, and along comes this amazingly scruffy-looking guy, hair all over the place, you know, probably 3 days' worth of unshaven beard. And these eyes behind these glasses that were sort of like on fire, okay? That was Bill Coffin. So I stand up, and he brings Bill Coffin over to me. He says, this is Dick Sherlock. He's going to read the Old Testament lesson today. And Bill Coffin took my hand briefly, but he looked at me and said, Sherlock, you're reading the most important part of this lesson. This lesson is the most important part of this entire worship service. You better do a damn good job. And then he left. Boy, I sat there the whole first part of the service before it was time to read that and just read it over and over again. But that was his main, that was the basis for the sermon he gave that day. And it was quite a sermon, believe me, it was. So that has a special meaning for me, that Ezekiel passage, but it's one of the most obvious times in our whole Bible that says that don't say that religion and politics are never important together, because God cares about the nation states. God cares about what's happening in them. And the word of the Lord, the living word of the Lord, can condemn them sometimes. Okay? We that far? Okay. Well, that's a pretty tough thing, that thing from Ezekiel. So I want to read our second scripture now. It's a very different sort of a set of words. Now, the Revelation to John is the last book in the Bible after it was put together by the Council of Trent. And it's a vision, it's a dream that John says he had while he was a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos. Patmos was a place where Greeks sent their political prisoners. So this is a long dream. How many of you ever read parts or all of the book of Revelation, the Revelation to John? I mean, it goes on and on with all these crazy visions which had to do with myths and stories from all kinds of other religions in the area and things like that. But toward the end, John finally, when he gets done writing down this dream, he decides to sum it up. So I read from the 1st through the 6th verses of the 21st chapter. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them as their God. They will be God's peoples, and God will be with them. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also was said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Little different than the words from Ezekiel, you think? Okay. It's talking about the whole world changing, isn't it, though? This new order of things. Jerusalem, the great city, coming down out of heaven again. Everything was new. And now, God's dwelling place would be where? With mortals. With mortals. Wow. You know what the word Emmanuel means? Yeah, God is with us. Literally. So this is a big vision. The whole world is going to change. Every city, state, every nation, every town and township and county and all those kind of things changed. And God's going to be in charge. So two different visions. One where God kind of throws everything apart in Ezekiel. One that where God finally is part of the people and the world is good. How many of you who were old enough to be either listening to radio or television or something 15 years ago this day remember what you were doing and where you were? How many? Yeah, most of us, huh? Most of us. I was sitting in my study in our house in Connecticut. I know I was working on some church stuff at the computer. It wasn't the sermon because it was already ready for that following Sunday. It was a Tuesday, I remember that much. And the phone rings, and so I answer it. It's my daughter, my older daughter, Kristen, who at that time was working in advertising in Manhattan. And she had gotten off of her subway, and she got off of it way up at 49th Street, and she liked to walk down Fifth Avenue all the way down to, I can't remember what street it was, and over 3rd Avenue to the place she worked. And she called me and she said, "Dad, something funny just happened. It sounded like a really big plane came in very low, and then there was some kind of a noise. And now I hear all kinds of sirens and everything." So I went over and turned on the television to the Today Show, I remember. And there it was. One of the towers had been hit by an airplane. Nobody seemed to know at the time what happened, but I told her what had happened. And she said, "Well, what's going on?" I said, "I don't know. I'm going to listen. Let's stay on the line." And I'm watching while a second plane flies into the second tower. At which time she was still young back then, started running and ran about the rest of the 3/4 of a mile or so all the way to her office building where she was locked up for the rest of the day. Finally, they were all let go, and she had to walk all the way from there across the 59th Street Bridge back to Queens because no one was allowed to drive, no cabs, no anything. That's what I remember. And I was scared to death for her, But she made it through okay. In fact, walking all the way home with thousands and thousands of other people was quite an experience, she said. So, how about you? Did you start thinking about 15 years ago because this is 9/11 today? Exactly 15 years ago, did you? You know where you were? Did any of you not become upset by it? We were all upset, weren't we? Okay. It was the first time in modern history when, since all of us had been alive, let's put it that way, that our United States of America had been directly attacked on our property. And it was attacked, and it was on television. Not only that, it blew the two highest buildings in the world apart with monstrous jetliners, and it killed over 3,000 people just like that. It was a horror story, wasn't it? A horror show. That's why we still remember it. But now I would like you, if you would for a while, to talk with me about how we as Christians, as faithful people, need to understand what happened then and what continues to happen now. Give it maybe a bigger picture than even that day, and see what that dream on the Isle of Patmos meant for us. Some of us remember when we were going to school in the 1950s, and I think even maybe in the early 60s, remember the bomb drills? Remember how we had to practice crawling under our desks? Remember that? Yeah. Well, you know, we kind of chuckle at that now because it was such a long time ago. And even I back then, I'll bet some of you did too, wondered, what's this desk going to do for me, you know? But still, we had those because, you know, we were worried about some force outside of us that was going to come and attack us. It never happened. I wasn't yet born when an event called Pearl Harbor happened. How many of you were? Okay. Do you remember it? You don't, you're too little, yeah. Well, it was just as big, if not bigger, event at that time in history for the United States as was 9/11 for us. Did you know that? It was a total surprise. The United States was sure that the Southwest Pacific, Hawaii, was an absolutely impregnable naval fortress. And in a few hours, the entire Pacific fleet was destroyed. And not far away, in a few hours, the entire Naval Air Force that was, for some reason, still on the ground was destroyed too. Just like that. Do you remember the reaction in the United States? Have any of you ever read history about it? It's quite amazing. You know, the United States was terribly angry at Japan because, quote, they had been negotiating with us at the time. You know, nobody likes to admit it when they've been fooled. And the United States, like no other nation in the history of the world, was able to muster all its resources, especially its production abilities, and build the instruments of war, and after many years, along with allies, finally won World War II. Okay? That's what happened. Now, how many of you also remember the internment of Japanese American citizens? Do you remember that part of World War II? Now, why were they interred? Yeah, because they're Japanese. They had some tie with Japan, and we worried that they would do something to us. And they were right here on the mainland, remember? Okay. That was so wrong. But it took, I don't know, 70 years for the President of the United States to finally announce that that was wrong. But not only that, what were the Japanese called? Yeah, on good days they were called Japs. Remember that? At the most they were called the enemy. That's the way of war. What were the Germans called? That was the nicest thing they were called. Krauts, okay? Imagine what we were called. Do you know what we were called by most of the people fighting against us? The devil. Devils in their language, really. That's what nations do in times of war. We dehumanize the other side. They are the enemy. In Vietnam, remember what they were? Gooks. Yeah, Charlie. Whatever. They were never human beings with families and stuff like that. And we were just the same to them. That is the way of warfare. That's what happened to us on 9/11, an act of war. The reason I ask, if you remember diving under our desks in the 50s and early 60s for the bomb, did you know that all through the 1970s in South Africa, all the school children did exactly the same thing, but those were called terrorism practices? Because South Africa was torn apart for about 10 to 12 years by apartheid and the forces that were trying to preserve it and defeat it and everything like that. The children in those schools already knew the word terrorism. In fact, people all over the world in 2001, everybody except the United States, knew about terrorism. In Africa, Europe, not so much. In Asia. Did you know that? Did you know that at the time? That what happened to us had been happening to other people for years. That we did not invent the word terrorism. We did not invent the idea of a war on terrorism. That was a reality for so many millions of human beings before 9/11 even happened. But for us, it was like the whole world had changed, wasn't it? There was now a, quote, new war. It was against terrorism. First time that anybody, including some of the amazing graduates of West Point and Annapolis and the Air Force Academy, they had never, ever even thought about how to wage war against an entity that was not a nation state. Wow, this is a whole new world for us, not for the rest of the world, but for us. So for us, it seems, doesn't it, like the world changed on 9/11/2001, 15 years ago today. Well, it did in a way. Globalization had become yet another facet of our lives, a global war that had people fighting that weren't from a place. And it's still going on. And it might just be that it'll be going on for the rest of our lives. Joe? Yeah, just a little bit ago, but since then. So here's what I think it's necessary for us to understand. First of all, what happened on 9/11 was just a symptom of something bigger, and it wasn't the first time in the history of the world it had happened, where people gave themselves permission to hate with no boundaries. Where people gave themselves permission to hate with no boundaries. Jihadists. It is absolutely not unusual for people who are waging war to try to claim that God is on their side. We did it in World War II. God wasn't, but we said God was. And so why should we be so surprised that jihadists who hate, that's what they do, they hate with no boundaries, want to claim that God is on their side? Hey, people, this is nothing new, but let's not corrupt our wisdom for the sake of our splendor and try to claim the same thing back. Let's not even imagine this is a fight between Christians and Muslims. It's not. Let's hold out that dream because it's our duty as religious people, as Christians, as mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and grandparents of children who weren't even alive but who have had to live their entire lives under the cloud of 9/11. It's awful, isn't it? This world is much more awful than the world I was raised in, or any of us was raised in. But we have to be the ones that keep alive that dream that there can be a new heaven and a new earth, and that God can be among us. Now, one other thing, though, that Ezekiel needs to remind us is of the necessary participation of the religious people like Ezekiel in being honest to every nation state, including our own, about the realities of their practices. In the practice of law, in the civil side of the law, not criminal, but the civil side, there's a maxim that says, if you want to come and sue somebody for X, you have to come with what's called clean hands. Did you ever hear that? It's called the clean hands doctrine. In other words, if you sue somebody for libel, and in so doing you libel them, your case is probably going to get thrown out of court. So it's very, very easy to be against jihadists, for all they are full of is hatred. And we need to be against them as a nation state and as individuals. What else could we do? Just say, oh, it's okay? No. But in being against them, we can't corrupt our wisdom for the sake of our splendor, for when they say they're fighting the devil, the United States, we need to have some cleaner hands when we say, no, we aren't. I can't tell you how brave I think a few professional athletes are to refuse to stand during the national anthem. Good for them. They're paying a big price for that. But they have every right to do that, and they're pointing out some uncomfortable truths to us as a nation that we'd rather sing about. When I was ordained in Cheshire, Connecticut, one of the persons who came to that ordination was this kind of storied professor at Yale Divinity School. He was still teaching, but he was retired and everything. Roland Bainton was his name, very famous church historian and all that stuff. Well, his, I think, grandfather, or maybe great-grandfather, had been the senior minister at the Cheshire Church where I was ordained, and that's why he came. So afterward, there was one of those interminable receiving lines. You know what they're like if you ever went to a wedding. They go on forever. And so I'm standing in this receiving line. I look up, and there's Professor Bainton. And I just about fell over. And he comes up, and he says, Sherlock, whenever somebody gets ordained here, I come because my grandfather, whoever, used to be the minister here, so it concerns me who we're ordaining. Did you pay attention to your ordination vows? And I said, well, yes, sir, I think I did. He said, did you pay attention to the part that you shall give your allegiance from now and forever to God alone? I said, sure I did. He said, so does that mean that you can't pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America? And I didn't ever think of that. He said, you better not. You just promised God you wouldn't. So I haven't. I don't sit down. I just stand there. Nobody knows I'm not doing it, by the way. But it hit me, and it hits me today, that we'd rather condemn somebody because they don't honor the flag. Baloney. They're saying, no, I can't sing the national anthem because I don't think the nation's being the nation it should be. That's what Ezekiel was sent by God to tell to the strongest, most powerful nation on the earth at that time. How can we not also be a part of that so that we can still hold up to our children and our grandchildren and their children someday too, that other vision of a new heaven and a new earth that'll be so much better than now. And let's work now to make this one better, so maybe the two just plain kind of merge. And the world is filled with the glory of God. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.